Hello to my students who bring me increased marginal utility every day. Now, if you missed class, you probably have no idea what I just said, but hopefully at the end of this video, you do. So we are in our last lesson of this unit called the marginal revolution. And if you missed class, we started with a couple of scenarios. Now, the first one is, I think it's one we all can relate to, going to an all-you-can-eat buffet. Clearly, I have gone to my share of all-you-can-eat buffets. That's why I look like how I look. But anyway, you go to the buffet, you pay 15 bucks up front. Now, in economics terms, the overall cost is 15 bucks regardless of how much you eat. Now, the marginal cost is also 15 bucks, and that's zero because everything you eat is still 15 bucks. However, the utility cost, how much happiness each plate gives you, gets lower with each trip to the buffet. Now, if you eat so much that the food makes you sick, the utility gets smaller and smaller. Okay, if you eat too much, you get the dreaded itis, which nobody wants. And then your utility is quite low. So this question is, how does this idea apply to life? Now, there's certain things where the first one, it's great, and the second one is okay, and the third one, case in point, usually people remember the first of something before anything else. That's just how human nature works. You're going to remember your first job and your first date and your first car, and usually it diminishes over time, and not always. Some things it's not the case. Some things can get better, but most of the time, certainly with food, the first plate, especially if you're hungry, it's like, oh my goodness, this is great. The sixth plate, and you are like, hunched over in pain. That's not much utility. So we talked about that scenario. In a second scenario, are these big contracts that happen in sports. And I gave a real life example. I am not a soccer person. I don't know the first thing about soccer. But this guy here is named David Beckham. Evidently, he's one of the best soccer players in the world. This happened a few years ago. But he was playing in Europe, doing his thing. And then in Los Angeles, the soccer club in Los Angeles paid him $250 million to transfer from Europe to LA. Now, on paper, that seems insane. 250 million for one player. However, once he arrived, ticket sales in the entire league went up 40% across the board. And since that deal, their old television deals were 8 million, now they're 250 million a year. So if you think about that, was that a tremendous amount of utility that David Beckham brought in? So you can see how he has this utility. And it goes back to an old point. I know you've heard this before. Adam Smith's in Wealth of Nations, once again, he wrote about diamonds and water. And diamonds are not necessary to be alive, and water you need to survive. Why are diamonds so expensive and water so inexpensive? We've been over this before. Diamonds are rare, take a lot of work. Therefore, they have a very unique utility, a very high utility. However, it's not always 100%. If you were crawling through the desert for 3, 4 days without a drop of water, and you finally arrive to a person and they have a case of ice cold water or a diamond, you'll probably take the water at that point. However, diamonds are expensive, water's cheap because of supply and demand, scarcity. Okay, so going back to this, David Beckham is the diamond. Okay, and hopefully you get that parallel. Okay, so this is the fifth and final economist we were learning about during this unit. And this guy's named Alfred Marshall. He was an English guy, and he was a hotshot like the other four we met. But he was really the father of this idea called marginal utility. Now, there's other economists, but he is the guy. So when I say, you know, marginal utility, you think Alfred Marshall. So we talked about him in class. Okay, so here's the nuts and bolts of things. Now, utility theory it explains how and why people choose what they do, aiming to get the most personal benefit from their decision. We all do this. An absolute measure of utility is not possible because the perception of satisfaction differs among individuals. It changes. It's hard to say it's, one flavor because what's valuable to one person is not valuable to the other. For one person, it might be somewhat valuable. To some, it's not valuable at all, highly valuable. Hopefully, you get that. Now, diminishing marginal utility is a common experience. We experience this all the time. Again, probably this class wasn't as exciting as the first class because, your first day of school probably has a little more utility than today. Now, it is a sufficient basis for economic predictions of consumer behavior, but again, it's just predictive. It's not like mathematics where it's 100%. We know the answer. Now, going on with utility theory, economists assume that the more pleasure a product gives, the higher price people are willing to pay. So, for example, people who like butter are willing to pay more for buttered popcorn than non-buttered popcorn because it offers more utility. That's a simple example. Hopefully you get that. Now, total utility well, first of all, utility is the pleasure or satisfaction obtained from a good or service, whereas total utility is the amount of satisfaction obtained from the entire consumption of the product. Okay, total in this case is the total amount that you enjoy from consuming the product. Then we talked about marginal utility. Now, marginal utility is the change in total utility obtained by consuming one additional unit or good of service. And the formula is you have change in total utility over change in quantity. So again, with each unit, it's going to have a change. Okay, so hopefully you get that idea. Then we talked about the law of diminishing marginal utility. And the marginal utility of a good declines as more of it is consumed in a given time. Suppose a person who enjoys popcorn can eat all that he or she wants for free. First box is very rewarding, third box is and then the fifth or sixth box, you're not enjoying it anymore. Essentially, you can have too much of a good thing. Okay, on a simple level, hopefully you get it. You can have too much of a good thing. Now, going on with the law of diminishing marginal utility, as long as the marginal utility is positive, the consumer receives additional satisfaction and total utility increases. Now, in class, we talked about when you stream a series and you get really into it. So, for some things like food, you can see it's a different thing. But let's say episode one was pretty good, but episode two is even better, and there's a cliffhanger at the end. You are chomping at the bit to get to episode three, and episode three does the same thing. That's why I think all of us have probably sat down for longer than we should digging into a series when it's streaming because it can increase. Okay. So additional quantities of a good yield increasingly smaller increments of satisfaction for some things, but not everything. Okay, now here's a Latin term, ceteris paribus. Now this is kind of an idea behind, this marginal utility. So let me try to break this down. Many forces determine how much we're willing to buy. Go back to that supply and demand unit, all those different factors that determine that. Now, economists focus on the relationship between price and quantity rather than trying to explain all the forces at once. It's too complicated, too many variables. Price and quantity you can kind of dig into. Now, what ceteris paribus means is that all things being equal assumption. So when you are breaking down the price and quantity, you are assuming that all things are equal. That's kind of the philosophy behind this. So the concepts of marginal utility and ceteris paribus explain the downward slope for the demand curve. Now, with given income, taste, expectations, and prices of other goods and services, people are willing to buy additional quantities of a good only if the price falls. Okay, so hopefully you got that. So to wrap up, this is the idea as simple as I can make it. Rational people think at the margin. Rational people think at the margin. Now, people naturally think this way. It is the practical way to behave. We just do that naturally. Marshall simply applied something that's kind of common sense, but he applied it to economics, and that was a big contribution to economics. Okay, so now it's a foundational idea. But again, we do this naturally. I don't have to explain that to you. At a certain point, we make decisions that are good for us. If it ceases to be good for us, or it's not worth our time, it's just a little bit good for us, we stop. Okay, so hopefully you get that idea. And that ends the material for this unit. So we will review tomorrow and then take the exam the next day. And hope life is good on your end.